Hello and welcome back. This week we look at the origins and main phases of the Cold War, which lasted from the end of the Second World War to 1991. The conflict pitted against each other the two superpowers of the post-World War II period, the United States and the Soviet Union. It confronted capitalism against communism, and it was a fight for survival of each economic system. It was called a Cold War because unlike the previous great wars of the 20th century, there was no direct military confrontation between the big players. Instead, the war was fought on the economic front, with each side trying to undermine the economic strength of its enemies. The US and the Soviet Union did fight against each other, but always indirectly. The United States fought against the communist-subsidized North Koreans in the 1950s and North Vietnamese in the 1960s and 70s. The Soviets, on the other hand, fought against US-subsidized Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the 1980s. The Cold War dominated all political and military confrontations across the world during this period. Every country was forced to choose allegiance with one or the other side. In this way, the world became polarized between capitalist and communist nations. This week, we will consider the origins of this global conflict and the impact it had on international as well as national politics, economics, and society. So let us begin. The origins of the Cold War date back to the last months of the Second World War. At the Yalta and then at the Potsdam conferences, both held in 1945, leaders of the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union laid out the physical and ideological boundaries of the post-war world. Even though the three nations were united in their opposition to Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, it became clear that internal frictions existed between Great Britain and the United States on one side and the Soviet Union on the other. It soon became clear that the Soviet Union had no intention of releasing its control of the Eastern European nations it had conquered on its way to defeating Germany. Stalin justified his intransigence by claiming the Soviet Union required a buffer zone to protect itself from any future invasions. Practically half of Europe would be subjected to communist control. The United States and Great Britain opposed such division of Europe and had the atomic bomb to intimidate the Soviet Union. However, the Soviet military also outnumbered the US and British forces by nearly 2-1. This resulted in a balance of power that kept either side from directly challenging the other. In 1946, Winston Churchill, who you see here on the picture on the right, warned that an iron curtain had descended on the European continent, dividing West from East, capitalist from communist, and democracy from dictatorship. The US and its allies were concerned that communism would spread to other countries as a result of the extreme destruction and poverty that was brought about by 6 years of World War. The fear that one country falling to communism would lead the neighboring countries to follow suit, like dominoes falling, led the United States to seek to contain the spread of communism, no matter where in the world it arose. In March of 1947, President Harry S. Truman announced the United States' intention to, in his words, quote, support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures, end quote. And this was a direct reference to the aims of the Soviet Union to spread its influence throughout Europe and the rest of the world. A few months later, the U.S. put into action what came to be known as the Marshall Plan. The U.S., according to this plan, offered nations primarily in Europe money to help with post-war reconstruction with only one condition, that the country accepting the money remain capitalist. This offering of money successfully lured most of Western Europe to the capitalist camp. There are a couple of political cartoons that I want you to look at here on this slide. On the left you have Stalin trying to block a basketball that's labeled Marshall Plan. And the basketball is aimed at the basket of quote-unquote European recovery. The question is, can Stalin block the U.S. Marshall Plan? On the right, you see a different view of the same situation. A European statesman is trying to board a plane that is called U.S. aid line. You can see the dollar sign in the back. The sign on the left of the ladder, though, reads "Flight to Solvency," meaning economic recovery. So it's understood that the European nation is trying to get on this flight to solvency. However, the pilot is not allowing the European to board because he is bringing with him, you can see it here in the cartoon, heavy luggage labeled socialist theories. It is understood that the European can only board if he lightens his luggage by dumping the socialist influences. Tensions grew between the Soviet and American blocs as each jockeyed for position in all recovering countries. In 1948, friction nearly led to military confrontation as the Soviet Union blocked access to the city of Berlin, which was in Soviet-controlled Eastern Germany, but which, since the end of the war, had been divided into British, French, US, and Soviet zones, so all four countries controlled the city. Stalin prohibited its three partners any access to the old Nazi capital as a test of strength in the developing Cold War. As Soviet and US soldiers faced off just feet from each other at sector boundaries, such as the famous Checkpoint Charlie, which incidentally you can see on the picture on the left, the US airlifted supplies into the city to keep fed its soldiers and the population under its supervision. The picture on the right shows an American supply plane flying into the city as hungry Berliners await. Stalin eventually backed off and reopened land access to Berlin in 1949. However, the blockade had confirmed US fears of Soviet aggression. A few months later, President Truman approved the formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO as it's most commonly called, an alliance of most capitalist countries in Europe. You can see President Truman signing NATO documents on the left, and on the right you can see the original members of NATO in yellow. The Soviet Union responded a few years later in 1955 by forming a coalition of communist countries which came to be called the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact countries are in pink on the map. Europe was once again divided into two large alliances, as it had been prior to World War I and World War II. As tensions between these alliances grew, the prospect of another world war became very real. The Soviet-dominated East German government ordered the building of a wall separating capitalist from communist sectors of Berlin to keep East Germans from fleeing to the capitalist West. The Berlin Wall came to symbolize the Cold War and the division of the world that it had caused. What made the Cold War especially threatening was the potential for nuclear war and total destruction. After 1955, both the United States and the Soviet Union had nuclear weapons. In fact, each country had enough nuclear weapons to destroy the other various times over. Nevertheless, both countries continued to build more and more atomic bombs and nuclear missiles in hopes of maintaining an edge in the developing nuclear arms race. In the end, fear of complete destruction dissuaded the US and the Soviet Union from directly fighting each other. However, it did not rule out other forms of confrontation.